Hello, U.S. History class. Mrs. Matlock here, and I want to apologize up front because I am not going to be able to show my webcam today because it is not working. So you will not see my face during this presentation and it will just be slides. But I did want to take this opportunity to encourage you today because I selected this image that says every day is a fresh start. And sometimes I feel that we all need a fresh start. We all need to sometimes hit that reset button. So I want to just encourage you to let you know that each and every day you can wake up and attempt to be a better person and to do the things that you need to do to progress in whatever area of life that you feel that you need to do so in. So every day is a fresh start. Just remember that. Now let's get started. We are continuing our study today about the 13 colonies, and our last regional group is the Southern colonies. And these consist of Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And we are probably the most familiar with these southern states because they are closest to where we live, which of course is Virginia. And many of you have probably traveled to these states at some point, or maybe have family members that live in some of these areas. So, no doubt students always do better on this section because they're more familiar with it. Let's talk about some characteristics that the southern colonies share. Much of the social structure was based on family status and ownership of land. Remember, this is a very hierarchical class structure, just like in England. And the southern colonies as a whole are very similar to England. And so ownership of land was a way in which upper class differentiated themselves from the lower classes. And ownership of land equaled wealth during this time period. Without land, you did not have much hopes in the southern colonies of making very much money. The second thing is that often these large landowners, particularly in the eastern lowlands, which of course is near the coast, they dominated the governments at this time because they were the most influential people in society, and so they had the most influence. And these individuals, because of their close-knit ties to the Church of England, they also remained very loyal to England. And this will become very important as we move into the Revolutionary time period. So please keep this in mind. Closer social ties to England. And this is, of course, connected to land ownership because if you remember in our study from Jamestown, many of those individuals that received land grants were friends with the King of England and were called Cavaliers. So we can remember that easily because we are the Holston Cavaliers. But those Cavaliers were granted land from the king. So it makes sense. As you can see on the map in this slide, the Appalachian Mountains are highlighted, which of course is where we live. And we know that the way we live, even today, is very different than individuals who live towards the coast, even in our own state, and it's because of geography. And the same thing holds true for today. So in the mountains and valleys of these Appalachian foothills, people were small-scale subsistence farmers, which means that they grew enough for their families and maybe had a little extra, either to store or to sell to others. They were also hunters and gatherers, and many of these individuals who migrated further west from those eastern towns were of Scots, Irish, German, and even English descent. The economy was primarily driven by cash crops in these southern colonies, and those cash crops included tobacco, rice, and indigo, which were exported to Europe in order to make money as well as to purchase finished goods that were then brought back to the colonies. In order, of course, to keep these cash crops cultivated and growing, they needed to use a large source of labor, which turned out to be Africans. And we've already studied the African slave trade pretty extensively, and you've had a couple of assignments on that, so I won't go into that anymore. But we will continue to talk about slavery as we lead up to the Civil War. And then, of course, these slaves worked on large plantations in which they grew these cash crops. And the South was primarily farmland. It was a rural agrarian area for the most part, with few cities and merchants. I just want to reiterate those cash crops to you one more time. Tobacco, of course, was the primary cash crop during the 1600s. Remember its introduction into Jamestown, and it was primarily the cash crop grown until the middle of the 1700s, which is the 18th century. And then, of course, tobacco is surpassed by cotton. Then the next cash crop is rice. Rice was primarily grown in the marshy areas of colonies like South Carolina because the geography was more suitable and the climate, of course, was more suitable to growing this cash crop. And as you can see in the bottom right hand corner, they still grow some rice in South Carolina today. And then the final cash crop is one that you may not have heard of as much, but it's called indigo. And I know that you know that that is a color in the rainbow. However, it is also a plant, and um, what's extracted out of that plant is used to make blue dye for textiles. So South Carolina and some of those marshy areas were also good for growing indigo, and that was sent back to Europe for the manufacturing of those textiles. Now, we already mentioned the Appalachian foothills, and I showed you a map, but I also wanted to show you this image, and we're all very familiar with this scene. It's breathtaking. Even we see this quite often, and it still makes me happy to see these mountains. But anyway, these Appalachian foothills, people that live here do things a little differently, and so once again, they're relying on small-scale subsistence farming, hunting, and trading, and they have a strong belief in private ownership of property and free enterprise, which means, of course, that people have the ability to work and to make as much money as they can amass. And private ownership of property goes hand in hand with that. At this time, land equaled wealth. It was always very. One more time on the map for you, I want to show you the southern colonies. They're there in the yellow. So it's Maryland, Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. And then just to make sure that you know, here are those Appalachian foothills, which is that region along the Appalachian Mountains. So I have shown you that on the map. Now let's move on. Here is a bit of a review slide for you because we have already talked about the Atlantic slave trade and what happened during the Middle Passage. But once again, I want to reiterate that in the early colonies, they had indentured servants who worked for that contracted amount of time and were released usually after 5 to 7 years. And the first African slaves did arrive in 1619. And once again, that Middle Passage is that terrible, terrible voyage from Africa to the New World in which millions of slaves died from disease and harsh treatment and poor conditions. But all of this, of course, is part of the larger triangular trade, which, as you can see here, is indicated by this triangle. And there's the Middle Passage. So you would receive, they would receive slaves from Africa and go to the West Indies, and then maybe pick up some sugar or rum or molasses, and then take it, of course, to the New World, and then it would be shipped back to to Europe so that they could process those raw materials. So all of these continents were reliant upon one another for survival. Please keep that in mind. Now we need to discuss a little bit about the political structure of the different colonial regions. So let's start in the New England colonies or the northern colonies. They had a very different system than the middle or southern colonies. They used town meetings, which is known as an Athenian or a direct democracy model. And what this means is that all the men in the villages and the towns would go to a particular meeting place, which was usually the church, and they would vote. They would have regular meetings in which they would vote on matters of the colony and what should happen in the colony. And so that, of course, has its roots in Athens, Greece, and that's where we, as Americans, can trace our roots back to democratic principles. So that's why it's called an Athenian style democracy or a direct democracy, because all the citizens were directly voting on every single item. Now, in the United States today, that would be very difficult to do. We would get nothing else done except read all the new bills and laws that are about to be passed. But so that's why we are a representative republic, and we elect people to represent us, and in our state government as well as our federal government. So we do not have a direct democracy. We have what is known as an indirect democracy because of those representatives, like I said, voting for us. The Middle Colonies also incorporated several democratic principles, many of which did come from England's idea of Parliament, which of course was created in the 1100s. So it's not just because England was a monarchy, they still also had a Parliament. And so those Englishmen have these ideas as well. And then let's move to the southern colonies. They are the ones who are most like Britain. And these planters are the ones that played leading roles in the representative legislatures in the colonies. So they did more of a representative style government, like I mentioned earlier, similar to that of Parliament in Britain. Now we're going to talk about another very influential event that swept the colonies in the 1730s and 1740s, and it's known as the Great Awakening. So as you can see on this point number 1, it is a religious revival in the colonies. That's what it is in its most basic form. And what happened was there were a lot of preachers during this time that were upset that many of their parishioners seemed as if they didn't really care about religion and didn't care about God. And so there were certain religions that came out of this, and we call those evangelical religions. And for example, this is when we get our Baptists, our Methodists, our Presbyterians, our Episcopalians, all these different groups, religious groups. And what happened is too that this was a time of great preaching, and it was very influential in people's lives. For example, this gentleman here that's pictured is named George Whitefield, and he was actually from England, but he thought this was his mission to get the colonies to really practice their religion. Items that the Great Awakening accomplished was that it laid the social foundations for the American Revolution, because in essence people were rebelling against the church during this time, is that they were rebelling against some of the practices that the Church of England had. because this was a time of great unification. So I would really like for you all to watch the video clip that I have attached. And I mention it, of course, on the next slide because it doesn't show up very well on this video clip. So I would like for you to watch it separately. And here's George Whitfield's picture. I placed that on here for you to see. So go ahead and watch that video, and then you have a handout assignment on the Great Awakening, and you may need to do some additional research, but the links are provided inside of the body of the Great Awakening questions that you have to complete. So that concludes today, and once again, here's a map of our 13 colonies, which will be the United States of America before long. And I just wanted to leave you with this. I hope you have a great day. Bye. See you next time.